Welcome back to my inner sanctum. I'm your hostess, Countess Elizabeth, mistress of the macabre. People make mistakes all the time. Sometimes those people are pilots. As we have seen before, or if you have checked out any of my other airplane videos, when pilots make mistakes, it costs lives. Today, we'll investigate yet another airplane case where the crew made some unfortunate mistakes, which ultimately caused their demise and the demise of those on board. So, let us strap in our seats and enjoy our complimentary snacks so we can explore our grotesque curiosity. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was a scheduled flight from New York's JFK to Miami Airport. Shortly before midnight, on December 29, 1972, the Lockheed L-1011-1 TriStar crashed into the Florida Everglades, causing 101 fatalities. The pilots and the flight engineer, 2 of the 10 flight attendants, and 96 of the 163 passengers died. 75 passengers and crew survived. The crash occurred while the entire cockpit crew was preoccupied with a burnt-out landing gear indicator light. They failed to notice that the autopilot had inadvertently been disconnected, and, as a result, the aircraft gradually lost altitude and crashed. This was the first fatal crash of a wide-body aircraft. It was also the first full hull loss and first fatal crash of a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar. The flight was under the command of Captain Robert Albin "Bob" Loft, age 55, a veteran pilot ranked 50th in seniority at Eastern. Captain Loft had been with the airline for 32 years and had accumulated a total of 29,700 flight hours throughout his flying career. His flight crew included First Officer Albert John Burt Stockstill, 39, who had 58,000 hours of flying experience, and flight engineer Donald Luis Don Repo, 51, who had 15,700 hours of flying experience. A company employee, Technical Officer Angelo Donadeo, 47, returning to Miami from an assignment in New York, also accompanied the flight crew for the journey, but he was off duty. Flight 401 departed JFK Airport in New York on Friday, December 29, 1972, at 9:20 p.m. Eastern Time, with 163 passengers and 13 crew members on board. The flight was routine until 11:32 p.m. when the plane began to approach into Miami International Airport. After lowering the gear, First Officer Stockstill noticed that the landing gear indicator, a green light identifying the nose gear was properly locked in the down position, had not illuminated. This was later discovered to be due to a burnt-out light bulb. The landing gear could have been manually lowered nonetheless. The pilot cycled the landing gear but still failed to get the confirmation light. Loft, who was working on the radio during this leg of the flight, told the tower that they would discontinue their approach to the airport and requested to enter a holding pattern, which is an air maneuver designed to delay the aircraft already in flight. The approach controller cleared the flight to climb to 2,000 feet, 610 meters, and then hold west over the Everglades. Cockpit crew removed the light assembly, and Second Officer Repo was dispatched to the avionics bay beneath the flight deck to confirm via a small porthole if the landing gear was indeed down. 50 seconds after reaching their assigned altitude, Captain Loft instructed First Officer Stockstill to put the L-1011 on autopilot. For the next 80 seconds, the plane maintained level flight. Then it dropped 100 feet, or 30 meters, and then again flew level for 2 more minutes, after which it began a descent so gradual that it could not be perceived by the crew. In the next 70 seconds, the plane lost only 250 feet, or 76 meters, but this was enough to trigger the altitude warning C-chord chime located under the engineer's workstation. The engineer, Repo, had gone below, and no indication was heard by the pilot's voice recorded on the CVR that they had heard the chime, so nobody heard the warning. In another 50 seconds, the plane was at half its assigned altitude. As Stockstill started another turn, he noticed the discrepancy. The following conversation was recovered from the flight voice recorder later. Stockstill, we did something to the altitude. Loft, what? Stockstill, we're still at 2,000 feet, right? Loft, hey, what's happening here? And less than 10 seconds after this exchange, the jetliner crashed. The location was west-northwest of Miami, 18.7 miles or 30 kilometers from the end of runway 9L. The plane was traveling at 227 miles per hour when it hit the ground. With the aircraft in mid-turn, the left wingtip hit the surface first, then the left engine, and then the left landing gear, making 3 trails through the sawgrass, each 5 feet 1.5 meters wide and over 100 feet 30 meters long. When the main part of the fuselage hit the ground, it continued to move through the grass and water, breaking up as it went. Robert Bud Marquis, an airboat pilot, was out frog gigging with a friend when they witnessed the crash. They rushed to rescue survivors. Marquis received burns to his face, arms, and legs, a result of spilled jet fuel from the crashed TriStar, but continued shuttling people in and out of the crash site. That night and the next day, he received a medal for helping out with the rescue efforts. In all, 75 people survived the crash, 67 of the 163 passengers, and 8 of the 10 flight attendants. Despite their own injuries, the surviving flight attendants were credited with helping other survivors in several quick-thinking actions, such as warning survivors of the danger of striking matches due to the jet fuel in the swamp water, and singing Christmas carols to keep up hope and draw the rescue team's attention, as, at the time, flashlights were not part of the standard equipment on commercial airliners. Although I'm sure they meant well, I personally would not have enjoyed the Christmas carols. Of the cockpit crew, only flight engineer Repo survived the initial crash, along with technical officer Donadeo, who was down in the nose electronics bay with Repo at the moment of the impact. Stockstill was killed on impact, while Captain Loft died in the wreckage of the flight deck before he could be transported to a hospital. Repo was evacuated to a hospital, but later succumbed to his injuries. Donadeo, the lone survivor of the 4 flight deck occupants, recovered from his injuries. Frank Borman, Eastern's senior vice president of operations, was awoken at home by a phone call explaining the probable crash. He immediately drove to Eastern's Miami offices and decided to charter a helicopter to the crash site, as the swampy terrain made rescue difficult, and Eastern had not heard any news of progress in rescue efforts. He accompanied 3 survivors on the helicopter to the hospital, including a flight attendant and a passenger who lost her baby in the crash. Most of the dead passengers were in the aircraft's midsection. The swamp absorbed much of the energy of the crash, lessening the impact on the aircraft. The mud of the Everglades may have blocked wounds sustained by survivors, preventing them from bleeding to death. However, it also complicated the survivors' recuperation, as organisms in the swamp caused infection, such as gas gangrene. 8 passengers became infected. Doctors had to use hyperbaric chambers to treat their infections. All of the survivors were injured. 60 received serious injuries and 17 suffered minor injuries that did not require hospitalization. The most common injuries were fractured ribs, spine, pelvis, and lower extremities. 14 survivors had various degrees of burns. In the investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, discovered that the autopilot had inadvertently switched from altitude hold to control wheel steering (CWS) mode in pitch. In this mode, once the pilot releases the pressure on the yoke, the control column or wheel, the autopilot maintains the pitch altitude selected by the pilot until he moves the yoke again. Investigators believe autopilot switched modes when the captain accidentally leaned against the yoke while turning to speak to a flight engineer who was sitting behind and to the right of him. The slight forward pressure on the stick would have caused the aircraft to enter a slow descent, maintained by the CWS system. After descending 250 feet or 76 meters from the selected altitude of 2,000 feet or 610 meters, a C chord sounded from the rear speaker. This altitude alert, designed to warn pilots of an inadvertent deviation from the selected altitude, went unnoticed by the crew. Investigators believe this was due to the crew being distracted by the nose gear light, and because the flight engineer was not in his seat when it sounded, so he would not have been able to hear it. Visually, since it was nighttime, and the aircraft was flying over the darkened terrain of the Everglades, no ground light or other visual signs indicated the TriStar was slowly descending. The final NTSB report cited the cause of the crash as pilot error, specifically the failure of the flight crew to monitor the flight instruments during the final 4 minutes of flight and to detect an unexpected descent soon enough to prevent impact with the ground. Preoccupation with the malfunction of the nose landing gear position indicating system distracted the crew's attention from the instruments and allowed the descent to go unnoticed. So here's where it gets really interesting. Over the following months and years, rumor began circulating that employees of the Eastern Airlines were reporting sightings of the dead crew members. They would often see Captain Robert Loft and Second Officer Flight Engineer Donald Repo sitting on board other L-1011s. These rumors speculated that part of the crashed aircraft were salvaged after the investigation and refitted onto other L-1011s. The reported hauntings were said to have been seen on the planes that used the spare parts. Gossip regarding the sightings of the spirits of Don Repo and Bob Loft spread throughout Eastern Airlines, to the point where Eastern's management warned employees that they could face dismissal if caught spreading ghost stories. Here is one such tale. On the L-1011, flight engineers would usually arrive at the aircraft before other crew to carry out their pre-flight checks. On this particular day, a flight engineer was stunned to see an Eastern second officer already sat in his seat. He immediately recognized him as Don Repo, and the apparition said to him, "You don't need to worry about the pre-flight. I've already done it," before disappearing. Another incident was reportedly with one of the airline's vice presidents. At JFK Airport, an Eastern Airlines TriStar was boarding for its flight down to Miami. Traveling that morning was one of the airline's vice presidents. As a VIP passenger, he was allowed onto the aircraft first and made his way to the first class cabin. As he moved towards the seats, he noticed a company captain in full uniform and went over to have a chat. During the ensuing conversation, he suddenly realized he was speaking to Bob Loft. The apparition quickly disappeared, and the vice president rushed off to find another crew member, terrified that it could be an omen that something bad was going to happen to the aircraft. A search of the plane was carried out before any of the other passengers boarded, but there was no sign of the mysterious captain. While Eastern Airlines publicly denied that their planes were haunted, they reportedly removed all the salvage parts from their L-1011 fleet. Over time, reporting of ghost sightings stopped. An original floorboard from Flight 401 remains in the archives at History Miami in South Florida. Wow, that was truly a grotesque tale. I find these sorts of stories about doomed airplanes very interesting, but this one even more so because of the reports of ghosts and the reported hauntings of these planes that have pieces of the doomed aircraft. I actually have never heard that before. It's crazy to me that they would take spare parts from a crashed plane and use them on newer planes. To me, that just seems like bad energy. Nevertheless, may the souls of those lost finally rest in peace. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe, like, and share if you would also like to keep exploring our grotesque curiosity. We will meet again in the darkness of the night.